Hi there. Welcome to First Look. Thanks for being here this week as we move into the month of October and a new era. We have a new era in front of us because our new director of spiritual formation, Bree Lewis, is here. And now we have our Sarah Graham, who's going to be helping us out with some housekeeping, is here. And so we're a new look kind of staff again. So that's very exciting. And I have new art. Look at that from the flea market. Yeah, it's special, and it's. I think it really embodies who I am, which is really what's important. so, um, so now I've moved. This week I've moved from assistant football coach vibes to assistant football coach who coaches in Miami, Florida. So that's nice. I like that vibe about me. Um, anyway, so here's where we are this week. This is one of the last weeks that's, I guess you could call it a regular week, in that it's ordinary time. But because we're moving into in the latter half of October and then into November and December, we're moving into new seasons. So in a couple of weeks, it'll be Stewardship Sunday, and then it'll be Commitment Sunday, Reformation Sunday, and then it'll be All Saints, and then you'll have a week in November where we're going to do this pulpit swap. So the 13th of November um, has a has a Presbyterian women theme, and Elizabeth Hartwell will be preaching. She's the pastor at Highland, and I'll be at Heritage, I think, and then the person at Heritage will be at Highland. So it's a whole like swappy vibe. So that's in the middle of November, and then I think we're into Advent. Like so, it's really our ordinary time stuff is coming to an end quickly. And so today we have kind of an extension of a passage that we had a couple weeks ago. It's not in chronological order, but it's around the same place as our other passage, which was from Jeremiah. So if you remember, the Jeremiah passage was about buying a field, which is will I think be a very interesting passage for you to remember and think about as we look at this one for this week. Um, so this one this week is Jeremiah 29, and it's the first few verses there. So it's verse 1, and then it's verses 4 through 7. So it's a very short passage, but I think it's a really interesting one because it comes with a sense of worldview. So the passage that we're going to read, just to give you kind of the context, if you remember where we were before, we were talking about exile, and we were talking about just the breadth and depth to which that changes the identity of those who remember it, of the people moving forward. It changes the way that we really see the time of Jesus, and we see the ministry that he was engaged with, because that would be a part of who they are, right? An exiled people who return to their land and try to reclaim who they are. That's a huge part of the people that he was there on earth to be with. And so I don't think it's a stretch for me to say that when we think about how Jesus would have interacted with people, that we should really keep the exile in mind when we think about how he ministered to folks. I think very often we think about Jesus as sort of a second Moses, and for good reason, or a second Elijah, in the sense that, well, one, they're compared to Moses and Elijah and the Transfiguration. Of course, that makes sense. But Moses is a freeing person, one who freed the people. Um, Elijah is one who was speaking to power and performing miracles, um, leading the people prophetically. Then, of course, you think about the connection between Jesus and King David, especially when it comes to the line of the Messiah and the kind of lineage that's there. But when it comes to the people themselves, um, if they need a Messiah, if they need a Savior, it's from exile. If you think about the time of Egypt and the time in Babylon as at least similar, then what you get are a group of people who need to be restored, who need to be back in the right place, who need to be have a sense of home and identity in place, right? Um, that's a huge part of the kind of um, cultural heritage that the people would have retained all the way to the time of Jesus. It's kind of like, if you think about it, this is a trite example, I realize, but if you think about the way that we think about ourselves as Americans, for instance, we think about that kind of exploring, going to the new world, starting again, um, colonist, um, you know, um, American Revolution kind of history. I think that that's a big part of what we claim. When we think about our history and our identity, we attach ourselves to those concepts, right? Seeking freedom, fighting for freedom, um, you know, uh, rediscovering ourselves in a new place. All those things that we grow up kind of thinking about and imagining, that becomes a part of, I think, our cultural, social understanding of ourselves. That on some level, that's a part of who we are as Americans. And there's a lot of complications to that, and we could talk about that a lot. But I think it's still there, right? Those ideas are still there. Um, what did it mean for us to come and to do that? Now, the complications are, pretty big when it comes to the ways that we took over someone else's land, and we did so with the slave trade, and that led to a civil war and all those things. All that is true, and that it all adds to our cultural understanding of ourselves. So on one hand, we have this idea of gaining freedom, but then we also know the sins that we committed along the way to claim that for ourselves. And so it's not this clean and easy kind of history where all of it feels really prideful and like, we kind of pulled ourselves up by our bootstraps and did it the right way. We know that along the way there were serious complications and serious problems and that were devastating for others. It's not this clean slate. And the exile is the same. Enduring that is has its own kind of they would have to remember who they were in that. There's an ancient kind of heritage to that. But then also, how did they get there, right? So like what, and that's a lot of what the prophets kind of cover, in the same way that we might talk about, our own American history, freedom and the Revolution and the Civil War and the taking over of the land of indigenous people and slavery. It's a back and forth kind of thing. It's it has some similarities to the way I think we see this time period talked about prophetically. That you have here are the sins of the people, here's what you've done, woe to you, Jerusalem, woe to you. And then there's an exile, which is obviously awful, but then there's also the enduring of that, right? And so when you return from exile, it's like who are we now? How do we? This is part of our identity that we endured and we got through, and God continued to care for us. And when you endure something horrific, when you endure something terrible, there's a kind of strange pride that comes with that, right? And I think that mixture of things, it's clearly not a direct parallel, but I think that mixture of things when it comes to what we got right and what we got wrong, I think is there in the way that at least I read these particular books from a very American modern perspective. Okay. So when we look at this passage, this is a text that's written directly to those who are in exile, and it's Jeremiah giving the people some direction. So I've now spent 11 minutes and we haven't read the passage yet. So if you remember, in the last passage we have from Jeremiah, the text was about Jeremiah buying a field, right? He buys this field, even though they're about to be taken into exile and he's in prison and or he's been imprisoned, but he decides to buy this field because his cousin says you should buy it, and so he does. And it says a lot about who God is. It says a lot about hope and perseverance. Very close to that passage is this passage. So this, again, is Jeremiah 29. It starts in verse 1 and then it's 4 through 7. These are the words of the letter the prophet Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to the remaining elders among the exiles, and to the priests, the prophets, and the people whom Nebuchadnezzar had taken into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. And then it names a few things like, this was after this person and this person and that person and that person. The letter was sent by this person. Okay. So then it gets to verse 4. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Here's the message. Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters into marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there and do not decrease, but seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf. Pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. I have obviously not been through anything remotely close to what is described in terms of the exile. This passage, by the way, happens before the passage that we read a couple weeks ago. So that was Jeremiah 32, about him buying a field. This is Jeremiah 29, just a few verses before, a few chapters before. That would be a pretty tough sell in some ways, because it means something. And just a second ago, I thought of a kind of analogy, which I thought was kind of interesting. 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, I guess, we all started this is not a direct parallel. Again, this is just like my American example. It does not all of it works, but like just roll with it for a second. 2.5 years ago, we started this pandemic, and we sat in a room, in the Mangochi room, the session and I, and we were talking about, okay, I think we need to, suspend in-person worship for a while. And at the time, that was in March of 2020. At the time, I was thinking things like, well, hopefully we'll be back before Easter, or maybe we'll need to have Easter in a different way or whatever, which of course was only going to be 6 weeks or more from then. And then, of course, Easter became summer, and summer became the fall, and we met for a couple weeks in the fall, and then things got the cases became really bad again, and we know that it was um, pretty awful COVID wise from November through January, February of 2021. And so we didn't meet again. We didn't have in-person worship until after Easter in 2021. So more than a full year, really, that we had in-person worship in the sanctuary. And, there was a point when we all thought this would be something we were going to endure for a little bit of time. I was taking stuff home, like taking like papers and stuff home, like, oh, well, I'll need these over the next couple of weeks and then we'll come in. And of course, then I didn't really work in my office for 9 months. And we had to, at some point, shift our mentality from this is an inconvenience for a couple of weeks to this is who we are for a while. And so we have to start to figure out, how do we do this? How do we manage this? Especially when literally hundreds of thousands of people were dying. And so we were in the middle of this kind of both and world of, we're trying to keep each other safe, we're trying to keep each other healthy, we're trying to make sure that people don't go this, there's no vaccine yet. None of this is, we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know where this is going to go. And, so we kind of made our way through it, but on some level, at least what I heard a lot of people say, is that they started to do things that they hadn't done in a while, which was interesting. For us, we had all of these, the three of us, Sarah, Liam, and I, we had all these like picnic dinners out in our backyard, like all the time, a few times a week. And they were wonderful. And then when I think back on that year, that was probably one of my favorite things. And it was something that we would not have been able to do otherwise. We would have been spending time doing, meetings and whatever. And, some people took it as an opportunity to learn how to do new things, or get back into shape, or, like I said, learn to make bread or knit, or, for some people it was, a real time of this awful separation. And then, but at the same time, it was also like people learned new technology, and they learned to do things online that they would never have done before. Or, like they had conversations with friends that they hadn't talked to in a while. It was on Zoom or FaceTime or something, but they were doing it. And that was the way that we interacted with the world. Now, that is such a small something very, very small in comparison to the exile, obviously. But it made me think about a modern kind of example of that, the closest I could think of in the moment. I can't imagine what it's like, and I'm saying that one because I can't speak into, obviously, what it's like to be in the Ukraine, or to be in Ukraine and try to understand how to live and how to find joy and to do all that. And there are a lot of other places around the world where there is natural disaster and strife and those things, and that people have to try to find a way to live. And Jeremiah was encouraging the people to do the same thing, that you're not going to go there and just wither away. Like, you need to find ways to thrive. And the ultimate response to that was in the fact that he buys a field in just a couple of chapters. That he says you need to go and to make this something where your families are not defined simply by the the lament and the carnage that is right now. I mean, generations to come shouldn't just be born and raised in trauma, because this is obviously traumatic, and there's the Book of Lamentations and other things speak to that trauma and speak to those unprecedented kind of circumstances. But what Jeremiah, I think, is saying is that you need to find ways of allowing your generation, your kids' generation, to thrive, to feel a sense of wholeness and contentment and safety and joy. Because, frankly, they're going to be there for a while. And they were there for a few generations. It was roughly between 60 and 75 years or so that they were in Babylon, more or less. And then they were started to come back after that. But even that took a long time. So it was generations of people that were in Babylon. And so Jeremiah is trying to say, look, this is not something where you're just going and you're going to die there and that's going to be the end. You need to go and build houses and plant gardens and get married and have children and have some sort of sense of self, because eventually you're going to come back here, and the people need to be strong, and they need to know how to survive and how to live full lives, because they're going to need to live them here someday. And so that were the things I started to think about. I don't know if any of those examples will show up in the sermon on Sunday, but the thinking about how do we, what do we do in the midst of not ideal circumstances, and we can always find them, right? I mean, I think we can always find, even if they're really, really small in comparison, we can always find a way to say, what do we do with the spot that we're in? Now, a kind of classic way of saying that is to either to find a silver lining, or if you're given lemons, make lemonade. And I think even Ralph Lowe talked about that in his sermon when he was here. He used that example. But he said, unless there's, I'm not going to get it right exactly, unless there's some sugar, that's going to be really bad lemonade, right? And that we need to find, we need to find more. We need more. And I think that in part, that's what Jeremiah is trying to get them to look for, to find something that is reconciling and, gives them purpose. Because if you're going to live your entire life, if some of those people, the children of those who had not been born yet, would be born in Babylon, and they might die in Babylon, and so their entire life would be, in exile. And Jeremiah didn't want those people to live lives without meaning. And so, there's a lot for us to kind of think about when it comes to what that means for us. That regardless of where we are or when we're born, that we shouldn't be living lives without meaning and purpose, because we're always in between things. Nations are, people are, etc. So I think it's a really powerful passage, and it's very short, but the impact, I think, of what Jeremiah is trying to get the people to think through, I think is a lot. So think about some of the analogies that I gave you there about, American colonial Revolutionary War kind of stuff. Think about the COVID thing. Um, but then just also think this week about the places where you have found yourself, and and how you have tried to um, you know, sprout where you were planted, so to speak. Because I think that's a lot of the passage. Um, because the thing that it it doesn't say is, don't worry about the fact that you're not in the place you should be. Don't worry about that. It just says to do well, and to, to do all that with a sense of purpose. Um, it doesn't excuse the fact that they're there. It doesn't ignore it. Um, they're still in exile. That's still an awful circumstance. Um, but within that, find a way to thrive. So it's not ignoring something, but it's not allowing that thing to stop us from moving forward, from progressing. That's my first thoughts for this week. So um, I hope that's helpful. Take a little time with the passage here this week. Maybe look at the other passage that we read from Jeremiah 32 and see how they kind of connect. And then start to think about some ways that these events, this period of time, um, shapes the culture and the mindset of the generations of people that would have been there to witness Jesus. How does the exile influence the way that Jesus interacts with and teaches the people who were there? Just something to think about. Okay. Thank you very much for your time. Thanks for doing this with me. We're looking forward to a fun week of new things here on the horizon. So, please join us in welcoming Bree to the fold. And anyway, we'll see you next time for another First Look. Take care.